Good morning. We're on page 15 of Vol.3. Then came the most righteous war in our history, to a country with a supremely just social order, and tens of thousands of people stood revealed as traitors. Where did they come from, and why? Perhaps the unextinguished embers of the Civil War had flared up again. Perhaps these were whites who had not escaped extermination. No, I've mentioned before that many white emigres, including the thrice accursed Denikin, took sides with the Soviet Union against Hitler. They had freedom of choice, and that was what they chose. These tens and hundreds of thousands, police and executioners, headmen and interpreters, were all ordinary Soviet citizens, and there were many young people among them who had grown up since the revolution. What made them do it? What sort of people were they? For the most part, people who had fallen, themselves and their families, under the caterpillar tracks of the 20s and 30s. People who had lost parents, relatives, loved ones, in the turbid streams of our sewage system, or who themselves had time and again sunk and struggled to the surface in camps and places of banishment. People who knew well enough what it was to stand with feet numb and frostbitten in a queue at the parcels window. People who, in those cruel decades, had found themselves severed, brutally cut off from the most precious thing on earth, the land itself, though it had been promised to them incidentally by the great decree of 1917, and though they had been called upon to shed their blood for it in the Civil War. Quite another matter are the country residences brought and bequeathed by Soviet officers. The fenced-in manorial domains outside Moscow, that's ours, and it's all right. Then some people had been seized for snipping ears of wheat or rye, and some deprived of the right to live where they wished, or the right to follow long-practiced and well-loved trade. No one now remembers how frantically we persecuted craftsmen. All such people are spoken of nowadays, especially by professional agitators and the proletarian vigilantes of October, with a contemptuous compression of the limbs. People with a grudge against the Soviet state, former repressed persons, sons of their former Gulag class, people secretly harboring black resentment of Soviet power. One says it, and another nods his head, without explained anything, and though the people's state had the right to offend its citizen, as though this were the essential defect, the root of the evil, people with a grudge, secretly resentful, and no one cries out, "How can you? Damn your insolence!" Do you not hold that being determines consciousness, or only when it suits you, and when it doesn't suit you, it ceases to be true? Then again, some of us are very good at saying, and a shadow flits over our faces, well, yes, certain errors were committed. Always the same disingenuously innocent, impersonal form were committed, only nobody knows by whom. You might also think that it was by ordinary workers, men who shift heavy loads by collective farmers. Nobody has the courage to say the party committed them. Our irremovable and irresponsible leaders committed them. Yet by whom, except those who had power? Could such errors be committed? Lump all the blame on Stalin? Have you no sense of humor? If Stalin committed all these errors, where were you at the time? You were ruling millions. In any case, Even these mistakes have faded in our eyes to a dim, shapeless blur, and they are no longer regarded as the result of stupidity, fanaticism, and malice. They are all subsumed in the only mistake acknowledged, that communists jailed communists. If 15 to 17 million peasants were ruined, sent off for destruction, scattered about the country without the right to remember their parents or mention them by name, that was apparently no mistake. And all the tributary streams of the sewage systems surveyed at the beginning of this book were also, it seems, no mistake. That they were utterly unprepared for war with Hitler, emptily vainglorious, and that they retreated shamefully, changing their slogans as they ran. That only I have been fighting for Holy Russia halted the Germans on the Volga. All this turns out to be not a silly blunder, but possibly Stalin's greatest achievement. In the space of 2 months, we abandoned nearly 1/3 of our population to the enemy, including all those incompletely destroyed families, including camps with several thousand inmates who scattered as soon as their guards ran forth, including prisons in the Ukraine and the Baltic states, where smoke still hung in the air after the mass shooting of political prisoners. As long as we were strong, we smothered these unfortunates, hounded them, denied them work, drove them from their homes, hurried them into their graves. When our weakness was revealed, we immediately demanded that they should forget all the harm done them, forget their parents and children, forget the parents and children who had died of hunger in the tundra, forget the executions, forget how we ruined them, forget our ingratitude to them, forget interrogation and torture at the hands of the NKVD, forget the starvation camps, and immediately join the partisans, go underground to defend the homeland, and with no thought for their lives. There was no need for us to change. No one held out hope that when we came back, we should treat them any differently, no longer hounding, harassing, jailing, and shooting them. Given this state of affairs, should we be surprised that too many people welcomed the arrival of the Germans? Or surprised that there were so few who did? The Germans could sometimes be the instrument of justice. Remember what happened to people who had served in Soviet times as informers, shooting of the deacon at the Naberezhna Nikolskaya church in Kiev, for instance, and there were scores of similar cases. And the believers, for 20 years on end, religious belief was persecuted, and churches closed down. The Germans came, and churches began to open their doors. Our masters lacked the nerve to shut them down again, immediately after the German withdrawal. In Rostov-on-the-Don, for instance, the ceremonial opening of the churches was an occasion for mass rejoicing. Great crowds gathered. They were nonetheless supposed to be cursed by Germans for this. In Rostov again, in the first days of the war, Alexander Petrovich M., an engineer, was arrested and died in a cell under interrogation. For several anxious months, his wife expected to be arrested herself. Only when the Germans came could she go to bed with a quiet mind. Now at least I can get some sleep. Should she instead have prayed for the return of her tormentors? In May 1943, when the Germans were in Vinitsa, men digging in an orchard on Podlesnaya Street, which the city Soviet had surrounded with a high fence in early 1939 and declared a restricted area under the People's Commissariat of Defense, found themselves uncovering graves which had previously escaped notice because they were overgrown with luxuriant grass. They found 39 mass graves, 3.5 meters deep, 3 meters wide, 4 meters long. In each grave they found the first layer of outer garments belonging to the deceased, then bodies laid alternatively head first or feet first. The hands of all of them were tied with rope, and they had all been shot by small bore pistols in the back of their head. They had evidently been executed in prison and carted out for burial by night. Documents which had not decayed made it possible to identify people who had been sentenced to 20 years without the right to correspond. In 1938, plate number 1 is one picture of the excavation site. Inhabitants of Vinnytsia have come to view the bodies or identify their relatives. There was more to come. In June, they began digging near the Orthodox cemetery outside the Petrograd Hospital and discovered another 42 graves. Next, the Gorky Park of Culture and Rest, where under the swings and carousel, the funhouse, the games area, and the dance floor, 14 more mass graves were found, although 9,439 corpses and 95 graves altogether. This was in Vinnytsia alone, and the discoveries were accidental. How many lie successfully hidden in other towns? After viewing these corpses, were the population supposed to rush off and join the partisans? People, in fairness, we should at least admit that if you and I suffer when we and all we hold dear are trodden underfoot, those we tread on feel no less pain. Perhaps in fairness we should at last admit that those whom we seek to destroy have a right to hate us. Or have they no such right? Are they supposed to die gratefully? We attribute deep-seated, if not indeed congenital malice to these police, these burgomasters. But we ourselves planted their malice in them. They were waste products of our making. How does Krylenko's dictum go? In our eyes, every crime is a product of a particular social system, in this case, of your system, comrades. Don't forget your own doctrine. Let us not forget either that among those of our fellow countrymen who took up the sword against us or attacked us in words, some were completely disinterested. No property had been taken from them. They had had none to begin with. They had never been imprisoned in the camps, nor yet had any of their kin. But they had long ago been sickened by our whole system. In contempt for the fate of the individual, the persecution of people for their beliefs, that cynical song, "There's no land where men can breathe so freely," the kowtowing of the devout to the leader, the nervous twitching of pencils as everyone hurries to sign up for the state loan, the obligatory applause rising to an ovation. Cannot we realize that these perfectly normal people could not breathe our fetid air? Father Fyodor Floria, his accusers asked him how he had dared to talk about Stalin's foul deeds when the Romanians were on the spot. "How could I say anything different about you?" he answered. "I told them what I knew. I only told them." I only told them what had happened. What we ask is something different. Lie, go against your conscience, perish, just so long as it helps us. But this, unless I'm mistaken, is hardly materialism. In September 1941, before I went into the army, my wife and I, young school teachers who had just started working at the settlement of Morozovsk, captured by the Germans in the following year, happened to rent lodgings on the same little yard as a childless couple with Brunevitsky's Nikolai Gerasimovich Brunevitsky. A 60-year-old engineer, was an intellectual with Chekhovian appearance, very likable, quiet, and clever. When I try now to recall his long face, I imagine him with pince-nez, though he may not have worn them at all. His wife was even quieter and gentler than he was, a faded woman with flaxen hair so close to her head. 25 years younger than her husband, but not at all young in her behavior. We were fond of them, and they probably liked us, particularly in contrast to our grasping landlords and his greedy family. In the evenings, the four of us would sit on the steps of the porch. They were quiet, warm, moonlit evenings, not as yet rent by the rumble of planes and by exploding bombs, but anxiety about the German advance was stealing over us like the invisible cloud stealing over the milky sky to smother the small and defenseless moon. Every day new trainloads of refugees stopped at the station on their way to Stalingrad. Refugees filled the marketplace of the settlement with rumors, terrors, and 100-ruble notes that seemed to burn holes in their pockets. Then they continued their journey. They named towns which had surrendered, about which the Information Bureau, afraid to tell people the truth, would keep silent for a long time to come. Bronovitsky spoke of these towns not as having surrendered, but as having been taken. We were sitting on the steps and talking. We younger people were full of ourselves, of anxiety for the future, but we really had nothing more intelligent to say about it than what was written in the newspapers. We were at ease with the Bronovitskys. We said whatever we thought without noticing the discrepancies between our way of looking at things and theirs. For their part, they probably saw in us two surprising examples of naively enthusiastic youth. We had just lived through the 30s, and we might as well not have been alive in that decade at all. They asked what we remembered best about 1938 and 1939. What do you think we said? The university library, examinations, the fun we had on sporting trips, dances, amateur concerts, and of course love affairs. We were at the age for love. But hadn't any of our professors been put away at that time? Yes, we supposed that 2 or 3 of them had been. Their places were taken by senior lecturers. What about students? Had any of them gone inside? We remembered that some senior students had indeed been jailed. And what did you make of it? Nothing. We carried on dancing. And no one near to you was touched? No one. It's a terrible thing, and I want to recall it with absolute precision. It is all the most terrible, because I was not one of the people sporting and dancing set, nor one of those obsessive people buried in books and formula. I was keenly interested in politics from the age of 10. Even as a callow adolescent, I did not believe Wyszynski was staggered by the fraudulence of the famous trials, but nothing led me to draw the line connecting those minute Moscow trials, which seemed so tremendous at the time, with the huge crushing wheel rolling through the land. The number of its victims somehow escaped notice. I'd spent my childhood in queues for bread, for milk, for meal. Meat was a thing unknown at the time. But I could not make the connection between the lack of bread and the ruin of the countryside, or understand why it had happened. We were provided with another formula: temporary difficulties. Every night in the large town where we lived, hour after hour, people were being hauled off to jail. But I did not walk the streets at night, and in the daytime. The families of those arrested hung out no black flags, nor did my classmates say a word about their fathers being taken away. According to the newspapers, there wasn't a cloud in the sky, and young men are so eager to believe that all is well. I understand now how dangerous it was for the Bronovitskys to tell us anything, but he gave us just a peep into his past, this old engineer who had gotten away of one of the OGPU's cruelest blows. He had lost his health in prison and pulled in a time or two, got to know quite a few camps, but he had talked with blazing passion only about Kadskin in its early days, about the water poisoned by copper, about the poisoned air, about the murders, about the futility of complaints to Moscow. The very word Kadsgan made your flesh creep, like steel wool rubbed on skin, or like the tails of its pitiless waves. And yet, did this Kadsgan have the slightest effect on our way of looking at the world? Of course not. It was not very near. It was not happening to us. You have to experience it for yourself. It is better not to think of it, better to forget. There in Kadsgan, when Bronovitsky was allowed outside the guarded area, his present wife, then a mere girl, had come to him, and they had been married with the barbed wire for witness. When war broke out, they were, by some miracle, at liberty in Morozovsk, with black marks on their passports, of course. He was working in some wretched construction agency, and she was a bookkeeper. I went off to the army, and my wife left Morozovsk. The settlement came under German occupation, then it was liberated, and one day my wife wrote to me at the front. Can you imagine it? They say that Bronovitsky acted as burgomaster for the Germans while they were in Morozovsk. How disgusting. I was just as shocked. Filthy thing to do, I thought. But a few more years went by, lying on the sleeping platform in some dark jail and turning things over in my mind. I remembered Bronovitsky, and I was no longer schoolboyishly self-righteous, no longer so schoolboyishly self-righteous. They had unjustly taken his job from him, given him work that was beneath him, locked him up, tortured him, beaten him, starved him, spat in his face. What was he supposed to do? He was supposed to believe that all this was the price of progress, and that his own life, spiritual and physical, and the lives of those dear to him, the anguished lives of our whole people, were of no significance. Through the smoke screen of the personality, called thin and ineffectual as it is, through the intervening layers of time in which we have changed, each of which has its own sharp angle of refraction, we see neither ourselves nor the 30s in true perspective and true shape. Idolization of Stalin, boundless and unquestioning faith, were not characteristic of the whole people, but only of the party and of the Komsomol, of urban youth in schools and universities, of our Saxon intellectuals, a surrogate for those who had been destroyed or dispersed, and to some extent of the urban petty bourgeoisie, the working class. Their loudspeakers were never switched off from the morning chimes of the Spassky Belfry to the playing of the Internationale at midnight, and for them the voice of the radio announcer Levitan became the voice of conscience. I say to some extent because labor legislation like the 20 minutes late decree and the tying of the workers to their factories enlisted no supporters. All the same, there was an urban minority, and not such a small one, outnumbering at least the several millions, who pulled out the radio plug and discussed whenever they dared. On every page of every newspaper, they saw merely a spreading stain of lies, and polling for these millions was a day of suffering and humiliation. For this minority, the dictatorship existing in our country was neither proletarian nor national in character, nor yet, for those who recalled the original sense of the word, Soviet, but the dictatorship of another minority, an an usurping minority, which was very far from being a spiritual elite. Mankind is almost incapable of dispassionate, unemotional thinking in something which he has recognized as evil, can seldom force himself to see what is good. Not everything in our lives was foul, not every word in the papers was false, but the minority, downtrodden, bullied, beset by stool pigeons, saw life in our country as an abomination from top to bottom, saw every page in the newspapers as one long lie. Let us recall that in those days there were no Western broadcasts in Russia, and the number of private radio sets was inconsiderable, so that a citizen could obtain information only from our newspapers and the official radio, in which Bronowitsky and his like expected from experience to find only cowardly suppression of facts or a vexatious tangle of lies. Everything that was written about other countries, about the inevitable collapse of the West in 1930, about the treachery of Western socialists, about the passionate hostility of all Spain to Franco, or in 1942, about Nehru's treasonable aspiration to freedom in India, which of course weakened our ally, the British Empire. All this proved to be nothing but lies. The maddeningly monotonous, hate-filled propaganda conducted on the principle that he who is not for us is against us had never drawn distinctions between the attitudes of Maria Spiridonova and Nicholas II, those of Leon Blum and Hitler, those of the British Parliament and the German Reichstag. So when Bronowitsky read apparently fantastic stories about bonfires of books in German squares and the resurrection of some sort of ancient Teutonic savagery, we must not forget that the Tsar's propaganda during the First World War had also told a few fibs about the Teuton savagery. How could he be expected to distinguish them from all the rest, single them out as true, recognized in German Nazism, reviled in almost the same inordinate terms as Poincaré, Pilsudski, and the British conservatives earlier, a quadruped as dangerous as that which in reality, in the flesh, had for a quarter of a century past been squeezing the life out of him, poisoning his existence, clawing him till he bled, and with him the whole archipelago, the Russian town, the Russian village. Then the newspapers were forever changing their minds about the Hitlerites. At first it was friendly encounters between 9th century and nasty Poland, and the newspapers were awash with sympathy for the valiant warriors standing up to French and English bankers, and Hitler's speeches, verbatim, filled a page of Pravda at the time. Then one morning, the second morning of the war, an explosion of headlights. All Europe was piteously groaning under the Nazi heel. This only confirmed that the newspaper lies changed as the wind shifted, and could do nothing to persuade Bronowitsky that other butchers on this earth were a match for us, about whom he knew the truth. If someone had tried to convince him by putting BBC bulletins before him daily, he might at most have been made to believe that Hitler was a secondary danger to Russia, but certainly not, while Stalin lived, the greatest. As it was, BBC provided no bulletins, the Soviet Information Bureau from the day it was born commanded no more credit than TASS. The rumors carried by evacuees were not first-hand information from Germany or from the occupied areas. No living witness had yet appeared. What he did know at first hand was that camp in Kazgan and 1937 and the famine of 1932 and dekulakization, and the destruction of the churches, so that the German army approached, Bronowitsky and tens of thousands of lonely individuals like him felt that their hour was drawing near, the hour which they had ceased to hope for 20 years ago. which is given to a man only once, then lost forever, since our lives are so short and measured against the slow pace of historical change, the hour in which he can repudiate what has befallen, what has been visited upon, flogged, and trampled into his people, serve in some way still obscure his agonized country, help to revive some sort of public life in Russia. Yes, Bronievsky had remembered everything and forgiven nothing. He could never accept as his own a regime which had thrashed Russia unmercifully, brought it to collectivized beggary, to moral degeneracy, and now to a stunning military defeat. He choked with anger as he looked at naive creatures like me, like us, for it was beyond his power to convert us. He was waiting for someone, anyone, to take power in the place of Stalin. The well-known psychological phenomenon of reaction to extremes, anything rather than the nauseous reality we know. Can we imagine anywhere in the world anyone worse than our rulers? Incidentally, this was in the Don region, where half the population were just as eagerly awaiting the Germans. So then Bronievsky, who had been an apolitical being all his life, resolved in his 7th decade to make a political move. He consented to head the Morozovsk municipal authority. Wow. Thank you so much for listening. Have a great day.